My name is Savannah, and you're watching The Sword and the Stag. Today we're going to be talking about the parts of a sword, in particular a one-handed Viking sword. Now, there are a lot of different kinds of swords, and there's a lot about the history of swords. And so if that's something that you're interested in knowing more about, anything in particular, leave a comment down below, and I'll try and do a video about it in the future. So to give a little bit of context before we get into the anatomy of his sword, I want to talk a bit about the Viking Age. So the Viking Age started in 793 with the attack on Lindisfarne Monastery. Now Lindisfarne Monastery is this monastery that was on this tiny island, pretty isolated, and didn't really have a lot of good defenses. The Vikings came in, burned the entire thing to the ground, and stole all of the church riches. Now, Vikings had existed before this, but they mostly raided coastal areas, and their boats weren't suited for deep sea travel, so this is one of the first cases of them coming really farther down south than normal, and kind of the rest of the world taking notice. So that's the official start of the Viking Age. The Viking Age ended in 1066 when King Harald, who was a Viking king, was defeated by William the Conqueror, also known as William of Normandy. Now the story goes that he took an arrow to the eye, but we don't know if that's actually true. What we do know is that he lost, and William the Conqueror went on to conquer, most of the British Isles, and that was kind of the official end of the Viking Age. Now, the medieval era started in the 5th century AD and ended with the basically dawn of the Renaissance, so around the 13th to the 16th century AD, depending on where you were. A lot of our evidence for early swords comes actually from Bronze Age Egypt. Now, bronze is what's known as a copper alloy, which means it's mixed with copper and other metals. There are two kinds of bronze alloys that were really the best for making swords. One of these was a copper alloy, a copper arsenic alloy called arsenical bronze, and it had a lower melting temperature and a higher hardness than pure copper, which this is a pure copper bracelet, and to just give you an idea of how soft it is, you can bend it easily, which is not something that you want in a sword, because your sword is going to bend and you're going to die. Yeah. The other kind of bronze was a tin bronze, which was copper and tin. Now, tin was really rare, and it was found mostly in Cornwall in England, Spain, Bohemia up the Danube, and there actually was some in Egypt, but apparently it wasn't actually utilized all that much until later on. So, you wanted your sword to have two particular properties. One was hardness and one was toughness. The difference between the two is that hardness is resistant to plastic deformation. Plastic deformation means that it won't bend like this. Toughness means that you don't make it too brittle, because the only thing that's worse than a bent sword is a shattered sword. So eventually swords were made out of iron and even some forms of crude steel, and so we're gonna switch over to the anatomy of a sword now. So this is a Viking sword. As you can see, it is one-handed because Vikings would carry a shield in the other hand. There are other kinds of swords. There's bastard swords, also called hand and a half, and then there are long swords, and there are even longer swords, which are called claymores, but those are all different, and we're not going to get into them today. The basic anatomy of a sword, though, is essentially the same, particularly for any sword that kind of has this general shape. So you can really apply it across a broad range of swords. We're going to start with the blade. So this is the blade. You have your point and then your two edges here. Viking swords were double-edged. Now, if you'll notice, the point of the sword is round, and that's not just because that this is a reenactment sword for hitting people with. It's also because Viking swords were actually rounded because it helped disperse the force on the blade more evenly rather than a point. Now, this channel in the center is popularly called, you might hear this in fantasy novels or fantasy movies, as a blood channel. It's not actually the term. The correct term for it is a fuller, and it didn't, make the blood run off the blade or anything like that. Its purpose was to make the blade lighter by basically hollowing out the center and leaving the thicker edges. Now, these fullers could be inlaid. You'll notice that I'm not touching the blade with my hand all that much. I'm trying to keep maybe a finger on it, and that's because the oils on your hand will rust the sword, and so you don't want that happening, so I'm just trying to be careful. You'll notice that the fuller, it's got a lot of space, and so in Viking swords a lot of the time it was inscribed with the name of the maker of the blade, or also with decorative wire inlays, so it was a piece of art as well as a functional tool. The area from the crossguard, which is this part, and we'll get to it in more detail in just a second, to almost the middle of the blade is called the shoulder of the blade. If I'm holding the sword like this, you'll notice that one side is on the side of my knuckles, one edge is on the side of my knuckles, the other edge is on my wrist. The side that's on my knuckles, the blade, was called the long edge or the true edge. Now this terminology isn't really thrown out a lot, but it still is used in some cases. The edge that is on my wrist was called the short edge or the false edge. The difference between the two is that when you're attacking somebody and you're hacking at them, normally it's the side with your knuckles that would go towards them. That's your true edge or your long edge. They're the same length, the names are just different. Your false edge or your short edge was if you were almost like locked in a pushing contest with the opponent, and you needed to reach around their back and hit them in the back, and that's your that would be your false edge. If we follow the blade down, we'll hit this part. This is your crossguard. In medieval swords, the parts that stuck out were also called quillins, and the center part that wrapped around the blade was called the quillin block. Now, that's medieval swords, not necessarily Viking swords, but if you do see it, now you know what it is. Following it down, this blade actually continues underneath the grip. This leather wrapping is the grip, and the metal thins out into a narrow band of metal, and that's called the tang. The tang would be surrounded by either wood or metal or bone, and then it would be wrapped, and so you have your tang underneath and your grip on top. Following it, actually we're going to flip this over. Following it, in this case up, you hit the top guard, and the top guard's purpose was to keep your hand from sliding down the blade while you're fighting. On top of the top guard is this little shell-shaped ridge, which it came in a whole bunch of different designs, and if you're interested more in the development of swords, you can look at the Peterson sword typology, which is a chart that maps basically their development. So this shell-shaped piece here is called the pommel, and the pommel and the crossguard together helped counterbalance the blade so that it was easier to swing. Now, if you look at the end of the pommel, you might be able to see it. It's a little rougher here, and that's because the way that you attached the pommel and the crossguard to the tang is they were partly hollow, and you would insert a pin, and then you would peen the pin, which means that you take a hammer with a round end on it, and you basically flatten out the top of the pin. And then, in my case, this is also a fused pin because it's been melted into the metal of the pommel so that it doesn't come out and the pommel doesn't fall off, which would be really bad. That's the essential anatomy of the blade, so running it back over it really quick, you have the point, you have your two edges and your fuller, you have your shoulder of the blade and your crossguard. Ugh. That's an attractive face. You have your tang underneath your grip, and you have on this side, your knuckle side is your true edge or your long edge, your wrist side is your false edge or your short edge. Following it down, you have your top guard, and then you have your pommel. That's essentially the anatomy of a sword, and obviously you would have a sheath. Some sheaths were made of metal, some sheaths were made of wood, some sheaths are made of leather. Mine is leather, and Viking swords, I think, more often had leather sheaths, and they were often lined with sheepskin because that helps protect the oils, and also the oils on the sword, when you oil it to keep it from rusting, would then soak into the sheep's skin on the inside of the sheath, and so every time you put the sword in, the oils would protect it, essentially. I hope you enjoyed this video. If there's anything you want to know about swords, feel free to leave a comment down below like I said before, and again, in an effort to keep this kind of transparent where I got all of my sources, I will leave them in the link down below, or in the description down below. The only thing I will say about that is because I have university library access, is a lot of the more scholarly articles you might need some kind of school library access to get to, and so they might be behind a paywall if you just go looking for them yourselves. There are at least 2 books I used, potentially 3, that I bought off of Barnes & Nobles or can be found free online. And so if you're interested in Vikings or swords, that kind of thing, then I would definitely recommend checking them out. They're good books and they're really interesting. Again, I hope you enjoyed everything. I'm repeating myself. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I promise I will do a video on knife throwing soon. I also recently built a PVC longbow, and so I will also be doing a video on that. See you next time, I hope, and make sure you hit the like and subscribe button.